expertise to resolve them. On the other hand, there's been a tendency amongst everybody approaching these problems to start with the technical problem and let that dictate the contours of our ethical response. So a good example of this are the early days of fairness in machine learning, where the focus was really on the technical problem of choosing the right fairness metric. Now, we've gotten past that largely in the fairness literature, but that's how it started. In our view, a better solution space and a better understanding of the ethical issues is available if we start with the fundamental ethical issues that are implicated by AI, and then work from there towards implications for specific applications of AI. Now, we hope to demonstrate that approach and outline in the specific context of thinking about issues of transparency in automated decision making. Okay. So the recent explosion of interest in artificial intelligence has been fueled by the development of powerful new machine learning techniques such as deep learning and random forest. Systems developed using these techniques promise significant gains in accuracy of classification or prediction over more traditional statistical tools. However, the mathematical models they rely on are said to be black boxes whose inner workings are mysterious, even to experts. More traditional systems, by contrast, are often said to rely on interpretable predictive models that are simple enough to be readily understood by at least some humans with the relevant expertise. Now, the difference between these two types of systems is widely held to be both epistemically and morally important. On the epistemic side, concerns generally begin with the observation that the relevant models are not a useful guide to understanding causal phenomena. On the moral side, critics worry that black box systems used in high stakes applications, that's largely our only mention of high stakes versus low stakes, such as medicine, lending, and hiring, can be unsafe, discriminatory, difficult to evaluate from a moral and legal perspective, and incompatible with legal and moral demands for explanation. Some authors go so far as to suggest that black box systems should not be used to make high stakes decisions at all, at least not if an interpretable model is an interpretive alternative is available. So our focus here is going to be on what we're going to call the problem of algorithmic opacity. Making good decisions often requires making accurate predictions about the likely outcome of alternative courses of action. In many contexts, decision makers can improve the accuracy of their predictions dramatically by relying on these so-called black box machine learning systems. But the increased predictive accuracy these systems offer comes at a cost of decreased transparency. The reason experts call these black boxes is that even they don't fully understand how they make predictions. Since these systems are increasingly being used in contexts in which the how and why a decision is made matter to us, the fact that the how and the why of decisions are largely inaccessible is a major concern. Or at any rate, the opacity of these systems seems like a major concern. While criticisms about the use of black box machine learning to make high stakes decisions is widespread in both public discourse and in the academic literatures of many disciplines, an increasing number of them, more skeptical voices point out that these criticisms have yet to be given a solid normative, conceptual, and technical foundation. These authors typically identify three challenges that critics of black box decision making have yet to meet. First, the concept of interpretability remains poorly understood, which prevents arguments against black box decision making from being spelled out in a rigorous, clear way. Now, this kind of skepticism asks, what even is this thing you claim algorithmic systems can't do or can't offer up? Second, arguments against black box machine learning to make decisions overgeneralize. They apply with equal force to more traditional human-based decision procedures. The rough idea here is that there are permissible decision-making systems involving humans that are opaque in similar ways, or that we don't make similar demands of transparency of human decision-making systems. So why should we see any particular problem with black box computer-based decision-making? And third, some critics or skeptics claim it's possible to address the moral challenges that black box decision systems are supposed to generate without abandoning their use. This is sometimes defended on technical ground, the idea being that we can apply simple fixes that can get us all the transparency or interpretability we could want. Or it could be on moral grounds. Here the idea is that the reason to be concerned with opacity, they're just not very weighty in comparison with competing reasons. So our goal or approach or our insight is to begin to answer the skeptical challenge while laying a foundation for further illuminating and precifying the problem of algorithmic opacity. Now, we think those go hand in hand because we think the skeptical responses sound appealing when they do and to who they do, because complaints about the use of automated decision-making have been pretty narrowly understood as primarily being about transparency. In our view, the literature on the problem has tended to focus on a fairly narrow conception of duties that we owe to decision subjects, which we're going to call duties of transparency. Conformity to duties of transparency typically require us to disclose information of some form or other to decision subjects. The skeptical challenge to this problem gets its grip in part because of this narrow focus. It may very well be that black box algorithms can be created that satisfy those narrow demands of transparency, or satisfy them at least as well as alternative human decision-making systems that we take to be morally legitimate. However, all that we owe to decision subjects is not fully captured by duties of transparency. We are also bound by duties of what we're going to call consideration, duties that require us to be appropriately responsive to the morally relevant features of decision subjects and decision makers' relations to them. Duties of consideration, in our view, are at least as important as duties of transparency. In our view, I think we are coming to believe that they're more important. We can't reliably treat people fairly or appropriately if we're not sensitive to their morally relevant similarities and differences. Moreover, one reason that transparency is valuable when it is that it helps decision makers satisfy duties of consideration. By facilitating oversight, for example, transparency reveals the ways in which decision procedures in question fail to be appropriately sensitive to the decision subject's morally relevant features. Finally, duties of consideration plausibly apply in a broader range of contexts than duties of transparency. For example, it seems plausible that small businesses are not morally obligated to be fully transparent about how they make hiring decisions. But despite that, they are obligated to hire in a way that is appropriately sensitive to the strengths and weaknesses of individual applicants. So in what follows, we're going to try to make good on the goals that I've outlined by saying a bit more about how we understand the structure and content of duties of consideration. And that's going to put us in a position to show the implications that these duties have for understanding the problem of algorithmic opacity and to see why at least some of the skeptical responses miss the mark. Now, we'll do all that by first saying a little bit more about duties of consideration generally, and then looking more closely at two variations, duties of evidential consideration and duties of moral consideration. Now, before getting to that first part and then turning it over to David, I just want to say something about what we are not trying to do or say. When we've had non-philosophers in the audience before, we've gotten questions about this, so I'm just going to say now, we're not trying to argue that we should always or never use opaque systems. We're not trying to argue that human decision-making systems are paradigms of transparency or some gold standard for decision-making. We, even as philosophers, know that we reason badly about all sorts of things. And we do think that whether and when to use algorithmic decision-making systems is context-sensitive. And as moral philosophers, our contribution to figuring out what to do in a given context is to help to uncover the range of moral considerations that should figure into our deliberations about which kinds of decision-making systems to employ. What kinds of decision-making systems to actually employ will require drawing on not only work from moral philosophy about which considerations have weight, but work from a significant number of other disciplines to determine which reasons have the most weight, how to develop systems that can achieve ethical outcomes, etc. So what we want to do is just to orient us to thinking about the source of our obligations rather than tracing out all the implications for a particular decision context. Now, I've given lots of talks to engineers, and that's not going to be very satisfying because you want to know what to do about a particular case, but we're just trying to give a piece of the roadmap for how to get to an answer about any particular case. Okay, so as I said before, in spelling out our duties to decision subjects, we make a distinction between duties of evidential consideration, that's duties concerning how we should go about forming accurate beliefs about decision subjects, and duties of moral consideration, duties to take certain features of decision subjects as morally relevant. Okay, so that's the core distinction between duties of consideration and duties of duties of evidential consideration, duties of moral consideration. Duties of evidential consideration, again, these are duties we have to decision subjects to come to form accurate beliefs about them in ways that are appropriately responsive to available evidence. Our duties of moral consideration to decision subjects change according to context. The relationship between decision maker and decision subject changes what we owe to a particular decision subject. Now, that's a fairly obvious point, but we're going to argue for at least one particular duty that has important implications for the problem of algorithmic opacity, and in particular, the response to the skeptic. So we're going to talk a bit more in a bit more detail about these types of duties in turn. I'm going to turn it over to David to talk about duties of evidential consideration and their relationship to the problem of opacity, and then I'll pick it up later and go into some detail about the specific duty of moral consideration and what it means for the problem and for skepticism.
Hi. So just one clarification about something John said. So when John said that the literature has been like narrowly focused on transparency in our view, that's really a criticism of the philosophical literature. A lot of the points that we're going to be making today are drawing from the literature in law and computer and information science, which has had a much broader set of concerns. So we don't really think that the same criticism applies. So we'll be drawing on that work. And part of what we're trying to do is to build a bridge between that work and some ideas from moral philosophy that we think can sort of help clarify what's going on. Okay, so as John mentioned, duties of evidential consideration require decision makers to form beliefs about decision subjects in ways that are appropriately sensitive to the available evidence. So we do some ethical reasoning and come to a conclusion about which features of decision subjects make a difference to how they ought to be treated. But we also need to do some non-moral reasoning to determine which of those features decision subjects actually have. So for example, suppose you're a criminal judge and you're responsible for deciding whether to grant bail to defendants who appear before you in court. And suppose you believe that the likelihood that a defendant will commit a crime if released is relevant to whether they ought to be granted bail. So you still need to decide how to predict how likely it is that each defendant will commit a crime. And it's clear that not just any method for making those predictions will be consistent with treating defendants fairly. So for example, just looking at the defendant and going with your gut would presumably be unfair. And what we're calling duties of evidential consideration are moral obligations, ethical obligations that govern how you ought to go about forming your beliefs about what decision subjects are like, what features they have before you go on to decide how to treat them. So in this part of the talk, we're going to identify 3 ways in which relying on a black box system might interfere with decision makers' ability to discharge their duties of evidential consideration. So first, accuracy. Decision makers have an obligation to use reliably accurate methods to make decisions about how to treat others. And while black box systems tend to have an edge over more traditional predictive methods, that's not always true. Second, ignoring available evidence. In general, decision makers have an obligation to consider all readily available evidence that might benefit a particular decision subject. But black box systems have a tendency, at least when compared to human decision makers, to ignore evidence that they haven't specifically been designed to take into account. And sometimes that evidence is just very relevant to how decision subjects ought to be treated. And third, morally inadmissible evidence. Decision makers are often obligated to set some kinds of evidence aside when they decide how to treat others. But as a growing body of research shows, black box systems can easily rely on such morally inadmissible evidence, unbeknownst to the people who design the system or who are using it. So that's the sort of high-level overview. I'm going to start with accuracy. So I said earlier that it would be unfair for a judge to assess the risk that a defendant will commit a crime if released by looking at the defendant and following her gut instincts. And at least one reason it would be unfair is that that's presumably not a very accurate way to predict the future behavior of defendants. So courts can't justify detaining some defendants on the grounds that they pose a danger to others unless they can give us a good reason to believe that their judgments about which defendants pose such a risk are trustworthy. And the more general point is that decision makers have an obligation to form beliefs about what morally relevant features decision subjects have using reliably accurate methods. And this is true quite generally. So you might think that black box machine learning systems have a clear advantage here over other predictive methods. So after all, the standard line on black box machine learning models is that they're capable of making more accurate predictions than is possible using more traditional predictive techniques. And that's sort of however we measure accuracy. But while black box machine learning systems often make more accurate predictions than other systems, that's not always true. So as Cynthia Rudin, among other people, has argued, interpretable methods often perform just as well or almost as well. And further, relying on a black box machine learning system that seems to perform well in testing conditions can actually lead you to make less accurate predictions in practice. So here's an example that you might be familiar with. I think we might. Yeah, okay, good. All right. So here's an example that you might be familiar with. So in the 90s, there was a multi-institutional research study that attempted to develop mathematical models that could predict patients' risks of dying from pneumonia. So they used a variety of predictive methods, including both neural nets and simpler, more interpretable tools. The neural nets performed much better than the interpretable machine learning models. Something seems to have happened with the slides.
Yeah, it collapsed. 1 second, David. You can keep
Okay.
going.
Okay, I'm gonna keep going. So the neural networks performed better than the interpretable models, which wasn't that surprising. But the researchers nonetheless decided to recommend not using the neural nets in hospital settings. So why would that be if they made more accurate predictions in the lab? So inspecting one of the more interpretable models revealed that it classified patients with asthma as at lower risk of dying from pneumonia than patients without asthma. So that's surprising, given that asthma is actually a risk factor for pneumonia mortality. So what was going on here? Well, it turns out that in hospital settings, patients with asthma are indeed at lower risk of dying from pneumonia. But that's because medical staff accurately predict that they're more likely to die of pneumonia than other patients, and they treat them more aggressively. And so a predictive tool that implements the inference rule that if a patient has asthma, they're less likely to die of pneumonia, would be making the right prediction, but for the wrong reasons. And relying on such a model in a hospital setting could easily lead to disaster. So you can see the problematic inference rule is on the slide. Okay, so why did this lead researchers to abandon the use of the neural nets despite their greater accuracy? Because after all, the models that were found to implement the rule on the slide were actually interpretable models. They weren't the neural nets. Well, since the neural nets are black box models, which by definition means that the researchers didn't really understand why.
David, your audio cut.
Okay, I think my audio is back. We're having lots of technical difficulties today. Okay, so all right, so the neural nets are black box models, so they don't understand how they were making predictions. So the concern was that a neural net that performed exceptionally well at predicting pneumonia mortality on the sample data might be doing that by implementing a predictive rule like the one on the slide. So a rule that performs well on sample data, but might fail spectacularly in actual use. And since the model is a black box, there's no guarantee that researchers would be in a position to anticipate the sort of problem before deploying it in practice. Okay. Slides seem to be, technology is not agreeing with us today, perhaps illustrating some of our general concerns. Okay, so the general point, I'm just gonna pretend the slides don't exist. So one way in which relying on a black box machine learning system might lead decision makers to respond inappropriately to their available evidence is that it might lead them to form less accurate conclusions about what features particular decision subjects have. So I wanna stress, just sort of reiterating something John mentioned, and this is gonna be true for other points you make. So this doesn't mean that we think that black box systems shouldn't ever be used to make high stakes decisions. So in some cases, considerations of accuracy might well give decision makers a decisive reason to use a black box system. So instead, the point is that black box systems have some distinctive features that can lead them to produce less accurate results than expected. And that in turn means that decision makers should proceed with caution before deploying them. So this is one way in which concerns about using black box systems have some validity, even if those concerns can be adequately addressed in some cases. Okay. So second duty of evidential consideration that we're going to talk about today is the duty not to ignore readily available evidence. So the aforementioned claim that well-designed actuarial systems tend to outperform human decision makers is a claim about averages. So actuarial methods tend to make fewer errors on average than human decision makers. But actuarial methods can be completely insensitive to relevant evidence that a human decision maker would be unlikely to miss, resulting in less reliable predictions for certain kinds of cases, for like a subclass of cases. Um, so for example, Compass is an actuarial tool, although it's not a black box tool in the sense we're talking about here, that predicts the likelihood that a person will commit a crime in the next 2 years. Judges across the United States use Compass to make decisions about pretrial bail. They're provided with the defendant's Compass score and instructed to grant or deny bail based on whether they believe the defendant poses a significant risk to the public. So assume for the sake of argument that Compass scores represent more accurate predictions of defendants' likelihood to recidivate on average than judges would make if they were to simply review each defendant's file for themselves and rely on their own judgment. That wouldn't be that surprising. It might nonetheless be the case that in particular cases, judges are in a much better position to review the available evidence. So here's an example of how that might happen. Suppose that a judge is deciding whether to grant bail to a defendant with a lengthy criminal record. So given the defendant's extensive criminal past, they naturally receive a very high Compass score. But the judge has a piece of evidence that Compass isn't designed to take into account, which is testimony from the defendant's neurologist. So according to the neurologist, the defendant's past criminal behavior was the result of a brain tumor that's since been successfully removed. And it's the neurologist's opinion that the defendant is unlikely to commit any crimes in the future now that the physical problem's been corrected. So we can stipulate that the judge ought to believe the neurologist and believe that the defendant is at a low risk of committing crimes. But since Compass isn't designed to take the neurologist's testimony into account, it mistakenly labels the defendant as high risk anyway. And that's a mistake that a human decision maker would just be very unlikely to make. So what's this hypothetical supposed to show? Well, it's supposed to show that the duties of evidential consideration require more of decision makers than making accurate predictions on average. So it requires further that they be appropriately sensitive to the totality of the evidence that's available to them. And a decision procedure that fails to respond to evidence that's both readily available and highly relevant is thereby unfair to any of the decision subjects who would otherwise benefit from having that evidence be considered. So the point of the Compass example is a point about actuarial systems in general and not black box machine learning in particular. As you may know, Compass is probably not a black box system in the relevant sense. But the issue for actuarial systems just identified, we think, is particularly problematic in the case of black box systems. And this is not a point that's original to us. So one common complaint about black box machine learning is that decision makers are often unable to integrate scores these systems produce with other available evidence that the scores don't take into account. So since decision makers aren't in a position to know which features of decision subjects are being exploited by the systems to make predictions, or more generally how the system is disposed to respond to particular pieces of evidence, they're not in a position to know when the system's predictions are likely to be unreliable or how to adjust them based on further evidence. When interpretable methods are used, by contrast, decision makers are often in a better position to be appropriately sensitive to the total evidence that bears on each individual case, at least if they have the relevant expertise and training. Okay, so that was the duty not to ignore available evidence. So the third duty that we're going to talk about is the duty to set aside morally inadmissible evidence. Excuse me. So a piece of evidence is morally inadmissible. So slide, I think. Excellent. So a piece of evidence is morally inadmissible for purposes of making a decision, just in case the decision maker is morally obligated to set that evidence aside. So consider cases of so-called rational discrimination. It's a term from the law. So these are cases in which an employer prefers not to hire members of a marginalized social group because the employer believes that they're likely to perform less well on the job than others, for the very reason that they tend to be socially disadvantaged in a variety of ways. So in these cases, an applicant's social group membership is taken to be evidence that they have some other feature, poor future job performance, that's clearly relevant to whether they ought to be hired. But even if we assume that the employer is right about the relationship between group membership and job performance, it seems unfair for her to take this evidence into account in making hiring decisions. So that's why this is called a form of discrimination. Instead, the employer has an obligation to set aside facts about social group membership and decide who to hire as if she didn't have this piece of evidence. So that's an example, a classic example of what we're calling morally inadmissible evidence. So what does this have to do with black box machine learning? So as I mentioned earlier, often part of what drives computer scientists to describe a machine learning system as a black box is that they don't understand what sort of regularities in the world the system is leveraging to make successful predictions. But if decision makers aren't in a position to know what features of decision subjects are driving a system's predictions about them, then that opens up the possibility that the system might be relying on morally inadmissible evidence to make those predictions. It's important to stress that this isn't a hypothetical worry. So the data sets used to train the kinds of systems that we're discussing often contain information about individuals that would be morally problematic, such as information about social group membership. And further, you can't just easily remove that information. It's quote unquote redundantly encoded in the data. Even if you like remove explicit information about race can often be recovered from other features, for example. But machine learning systems just have no compunction at all about relying on those systems. And so they'll readily exploit them if doing so will enable more accurate predictions. There are lots of examples of this phenomenon, and new ones are coming up in the news all the time. I'm going to give a particularly famous and unambiguous one that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. So slide. So this is a tech ethics talk, so we're obligated to pick on Amazon. So in 2017, Amazon was forced to mothball a machine learning system its recruiters have been using to evaluate candidates after learning that it was downgrading candidates who attended women's colleges or played on women's sports teams. So it turned out that the system had been trained on past hiring data, and that data reflected the biases of Amazon's hiring managers. And so they didn't discover this problem until well into development and after the system had already been provided to recruiters who were making hiring decisions, although there's some sort of ambiguity about how the scores were used. So the examples of morally inadmissible evidence that I've given so far are examples of evidence that disadvantages members of a marginalized social group in a way that seems unfair. But I should note that evidence might be morally inadmissible on other grounds. So one example would be private personal information. So you might think that basing lending decisions on applicants' web browsing data violates their privacy rights, and so is inadmissible on that basis. So this is sort of a broader phenomenon than discrimination. It can include other kinds of moral concerns as well. Okay, so just to recap the ice cream part of the sandwich, seems unfair to John that I get to be the ice cream. We have identified 3 ways in which relying on black box machine learning systems might lead decision makers to be inappropriately responsive to the available evidence. So first, by leading them to make less accurate predictions than they would otherwise make. Second, by leading them to ignore highly relevant and readily available evidence. And third, by leading them to rely on morally inadmissible evidence. That's evidence that they're obligated to set aside for purposes of decision making. So again, we see this as potential risks of using black box systems to make high stakes decisions rather than decisive reasons not to rely on them. So if the risk can often be managed, which might mean that on balance, you should use such a system. So, okay, I'll turn it over to John, who's going to say more about duties of moral consideration.
Thanks, David. Okay, so I said at the beginning of the talk that we think discussions of black box systems are too narrowly focused on duties of transparency, the duties we have to provide decision subjects with information of some kind when we make decisions about them. Now, David's made the case that we sometimes have duties to handle evidence in certain ways, and that has nothing to do with the information you offer up. And that reliance on black box systems can undermine our ability to discharge those duties. Now, another class of duties that we want to talk about are those that we're going to call duties of moral consideration. Beyond responsibly learning about someone's morally relevant features, we're also required to responsibly sort of handle or engage with those features in our deliberations about them. In the remainder of the talk, we want to draw attention to one particular duty of moral consideration that falls outside the scope of duties of transparency, and we're going to call that those duties of agential consideration. A duty of agential consideration is a duty that a decision maker exercise their agency, understood broadly to include their deliberative and empathic capacities, when exercising authority or decision-making powers over a decision subject. So to motivate the existence of such duties, we're going to start with a thought experiment, a classic philosopher thing to do, but I promise we're going to try to offer an explanation of the outcomes of this thought experiment. So computer scientists are able, let's just imagine, I hope this isn't true yet, Computer scientists are able to create what we're going to call juror models for any individual eligible to serve on a jury. These juror models are trained on personalized data sets, and they're able to predict with perfect or near perfect accuracy how a given juror would find in any given criminal case. After years of testing, the court system adopts the juror model substitution policy. Jurors are still called for jury duty. They use the same processes that we use now. Not now, maybe pre-COVID. Lawyers are given a chance to evaluate and dismiss jurors as usual. However, once jurors are selected, the juror may leave, and their juror model will be used to adjudicate the case. We can imagine that these models take in as inputs both visual and auditory information. We can imagine that when the judge tells a juror model to disregard some piece of information, either the model does so in a way that approximates how the juror which they model would do, or it fully disregards that information in a way that a human juror might be unable to. But in any case, suppose that we're as confident as we could be that the model will reach all of the same decisions that its counterpart human would reach. Now, in our view, there's something morally problematic about the use of the juror models, something that is not captured by duties of transparency or duties of evidential consideration. Instead, part of what's morally problematic with the use of such models is that jurors owe it to decision subjects to deliberate about them from a particular perspective. Decision subjects in criminal trials are owed deliberation by a jury of their peers, a jury that, to some degree, can empathize with the decision subject and deliberate about the particulars of the case and the circumstances of the decision subject and other parties in ways that we take it algorithmic decision-making systems just can't do at all. We think it's significant in some way that members of one's moral community have attended to the evidence, and they're attending to it in the ways structured by a jury trial is part of what morally legitimates the outcome of the trial. This is not to say that jury trials don't involve duties of evidential consideration. They clearly do. Maybe they also involve duties of transparency. Maybe members of juries do have a duty of transparency to decision subjects, a duty to offer up or be able to offer up an explanation for how they decided the case or how they went about making their decision. However, for a variety of reasons, including both to protect jurors and for reasons of efficiency in conducting jury trials, this duty is outweighed. So we don't actually make jurors give these explanations or satisfy these duties of transparency. So the point is not that these other things don't matter, but that if you fail to attend to the full range of duties that are owed to decision subjects, we'll miss important reasons for being worried about automated decision-making systems. So duties of agential consideration are not relevant only during jury trials. In other socially important contexts, decision makers will fail to treat people as they deserve to be treated if they don't exercise their moral agency in making decisions about them. Think, for example, of the kind of consideration that parents owe to their children, or the kinds of deliberations you owe when making decisions regarding things that impact your spouse. Now, duties of agential consideration are not exhaustive of duties of moral consideration, but even on their own, they go some way towards responding to the people that are skeptical about the problem of algorithmic opacity. Notice first that where decision makers owe a duty of agential consideration, that duty will provide a pro tanto, or that's a philosophy word, but a semi-weighty reason to avoid the use of an opaque algorithmic system or guidance for incorporating such systems into complex decision-making process. Where such a system would completely supplant decision makers with agential capacities, decision makers will just fail to satisfy duties of agential consideration. Where such systems would merely serve to supplement decision-making, whether duties of agential consideration are met will depend in part on whether the ways in which they supplement human decision-making detracts from human decision-makers' appropriate exercise of agency in the context. And the very opacity of the system might make it difficult to know whether they have exercised their agency appropriately. And that last point extends further, even if you thought that AI systems could themselves discharge duties of agential consideration, like some people have very reductive views of agency and they think computer systems could exercise agency in the relevant sense, the use of black box systems would make it difficult to know whether it's happened. While we don't know for sure that it happens in human systems, we have ready heuristics for assessing other people's stated reasons. We can look at their behavior, we can ask them to talk about their reasons, things like that. So the import of duties of agential consideration seems to be significant, even if we think it's in principle possible for machine systems to discharge those duties. Now, this is not to say that duties of agential consideration provide decisive reasons against deploying algorithmic decision-making systems, even entirely opaque ones. Returning to the juror model example, there may be scenarios in which the advantages of a jury substitution policy outweigh the failure to meet duties of agential consideration. But even then, broadening our attention to the way that we're calling to here pays dividends. So skeptics about the problem of algorithmic opacity claim that there's a double standard when we call for levels of transparency in algorithmic decision making that we don't require of human decision makers. But whether that's so, whether there's a double standard depends on the full range of normal considerations at play in each context. So let's just assume we go in for jury substitution. It seems like, on the face of it, we'd be applying a double standard in demanding an explanation for how the models operated, right? So like we don't demand that of human juries, so why would we demand explanations or any kind of specific explanatory output from an algorithmic system? But we actually don't think that's a double standard. When we substitute models for humans, our reasons might shift. So returning to an earlier observation, suppose that jurors, the reason we don't make jurors explain themselves is because it would endanger them or open them up to undue criticism, or because it would slow down the judicial process too much. In a possible version of juror substitutions, those reasons just don't apply. They would be efficient for them to offer up reasons potentially, and we don't have to worry about them being harmed by how people respond to their decisions. So you don't have a double standard. You have good reasons for holding them to different standards when you are attentive to the duties of moral consideration that we have. So whether it's reasonable to demand a level of transparency from automated systems that's different from those we demand from humans will depend on the full normative context. Okay, so it makes sense that people are concerned about the use of black box systems in high stakes situations, and it's tempting to think that this is primarily because of their opacity. That temptation has driven most of the philosophical discussion to the point it's at now, fixated on whether these systems are sufficiently transparent or whether they could be made so, or whether we can provide decision subjects with the right kind of information about them, even if they can't be made transparent in the relevant sense. Now, we think that's an unhelpful place to begin drawing the battle lines. We owe more to decision subjects than information, and it's sometimes the case we owe them information because we owe them something else or something deeper. So when considering whether we should deploy black box models in some particular context, we shouldn't begin by asking whether the model is too opaque or transparent enough. We should begin by asking how this context demands that we treat people, and then answering that question will help us to know what we're permitted to do with respect to automating any part of that decision-making process. Thanks.
So thank you, John, David, and Jeff for the very interesting talk. So I knew a lot of things that I learned today from the philosophical point of view. So there are some already a question in the chat, so I will read it. What if the decision-making process had a sentimental aspect to it? Would that not be able to be automated? So this is the question from Ashna.
Yeah, thanks, Ashna. Yeah, I suppose the question is in part a question about what kinds of what kinds of mental features are realizable in automated systems. So like, I think in principle, we don't want to take a stand on whether it's impossible to realize emotional states or sentiments, as you put the question in computer systems. I mean, that caveat aside, I take it, to the extent that I can interpret sort of the thrust of the question via chat, I take it to be, sort of somewhat friendly to some of the ideas that that John was explaining toward the end of the talk. Insofar as some kind of empathic or emotional response is important in the decision-making context, or as sort of put it in the language of the talk, to the extent that we owe something sentimental or emotional or empathic to a decision subject, then we might have very good reason not to automate a decision-making procedure of that kind, precisely because we can't, or at least we're not confident that we could discharge those kinds of duties via machine techniques.
So anyone that wants to ask a question can also unmute themselves and put your video. So Ashna, you're welcome to specify your question if that was not exactly what you were asking. But I think that the answer was accepted by the human. Oh, so she or he says, I was asking about empathy.
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah, great. Okay, good. I'm glad the response was responsive.
Yes.
Did you want me to handle calling on people, Ricardo, or did you intend to?
No, go ahead, Shingai. So you can do it too, Jeff, if, up to you.
I'd rather defer to you, just so there's like a clear person in charge.
Shingai, great to see you here. Please go ahead.
Thank you, everybody. And I was listening with great interest. I actually work at the Vector Institute for Artificial Intelligence. So I work with quite a few of the people that are developing these new and exciting models. My question for you is where to from here? So one of the things that I find is that this type of research happens in isolation. In another part of the world, in another basement with no windows, there's research on actually advancing the models. How do we get what you're doing and what they're doing into industry so that we can actually maybe stop a decision system before it gets deployed into practice?
Yeah, so we have a 3-point plan to solve this problem. I'm just kidding. Okay. So yeah, I mean, obviously important question. It's sort of like, gigantic in scope and significance. So, I mean, I guess I'll speak for myself, and I can speak at least a little bit for John. I know, because he and I have been thinking about some of this together, and I guess I can speak at least part of this will capture some of David's thinking too. But maybe I'll invite John and David to share any important thoughts that I don't pick up on here. So I think that, so one thing that kind of bugs me when people answer questions like this, or, write op-eds that are sort of like, meant to address it, is that I think there's like a little bit of a trap, a little bit of like a myopia trap, where people think there's going to be sort of like a unique social or educational or legislative intervention that's sort of like the thing that ought to be prioritized to integrate the kind of work as you put it in your question. And my view on this, I think, is sort of like we have a lot of kind of compelling hypotheses about what we could do to try to make a difference. So there are things we could do in higher ed, for example, to change the way that engineering students get educated, or for that matter, to change the way that humanists get educated, so that people like me, 15 years ago might have thought, oh, okay, I'm like learning this cool ethics stuff, but also I'm on the, along the way, being trained technically, and so that might, maybe that would have set me off on a new path. I mean, I think, similarly, you can think about what would have to happen within the organization of a firm to get, to get the people, with the relevantly broad expertise to integrate the technical and sort of humanistic thinking high enough in the corporate decision-making structure to actually, to affect change. And then there are like sort of like sociological questions about the tech industry itself, like how do you get engineers to care? Sorry, engineers are like sort of picking on you, but in some contexts, it's like there's the engineering and there's the other stuff, right? And it's primarily the engineering that matters, and we'll like sort of let the other people do the other stuff, and that's not going to work for for the reason that your question was predicated on. And then lastly, like, at least in some contexts, we're going to need like really strong external coercive measures, like legislative measures are going to have to prevent, private actors from doing things that they otherwise could. And my view is that we should sort of like stop the infighting with each other about, you know, which one of these is the right one to do, or, you know, which is going to be the one that saves us in the end. And we just need, you know, the relevant experts in all of these domains, like pulling really hard on all of these levers to effectuate a sort of like ecosystem-wide change in the way we think about things. That's like kind of a non-answer, but in my defense, that, you know, the question is like so hugely scoped that it seems like it calls for an answer of a huge scope. But John or David, do you want to add anything? I grant you permission to participate in the Q&A.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I could talk about that for a long time and care a lot about it, but I'm fully on board. Like, it's a whole ecosystem-wide thing. I really like. There's lots to dislike about bioethics and the way that it's gone since its inception. But what they have is a robust ecosystem. There's an expertise. There's someone that's like not a doctor and not a philosopher and not a social scientist, but can integrate that knowledge. But then there are institutions and conferences and repositories and regulations, and they all work together to sort of rein in some of the worst of what could happen in biomedical research and practice. Now, there's lots of things they got wrong, and there's lots of things to fix. But it's a much better ecosystem than we have in tech, and it's because we have all those bits working in tandem. And Jeff joked about a 3-point plan, but like some of our work is actually developing like a 400-point plan about like which levers to tweak where, and what are the productive ways to tweak those levers. But
so Christina has a question. I don't know if you want to ask yourself, Christina, the question, or I read it, or we have more female participation.
Yes, hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, got you.
Hello everyone, thank you for the great presentation. So I have a question regarding regulation and how can we actually tackle PAL. And my question was about the European Commission. Basically what they proposed was a horizontal approach. And I would like to know whether the duties that you have proposed that would basically solve a bigger picture of the problem could actually be regulated in this kind of approach, in a horizontal approach, and not a sector-specific one.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So let me reinforce a key idea from the talk, and then sort of like say something that might appear to contrast with it, but I think is like sort of in keeping in the spirit of the thing. So, you know, like a major theme of the talk was that we shouldn't expect there to be sort of like univocal standards for, you know, transparency or opacity that are apt across sectors or across applications of use. Sometimes, you know, opacity is going to matter. Sometimes it won't matter so much. Sometimes the ways in which it matter are going to differ, and these differences are morally significant, and they should sort of like tell in favor of doing different kinds of things in different kinds of cases. So there's a sense in which you know, a sort of blanket approach is looks disfavored by kind of the story that we're telling. The caveat here is that you know, once you sort of elevate to the level of answering a regulatory question, you want to be sensitive to what the regulatory options are, right? So it's consistent. This is, I mean, it will sound like very boring, like dry moral philosophers here. It's consistent with everything that I've just said about kind of how the ethics works at the bottom in the individual cases, that we might at the end of the day, you know, prefer a regulatory model that just says, look, if you're going to go in for automated decision-making techniques, you have to abide by, you know, this, you know, relatively narrow standard of transparency, say, because that might just be the best way to get the things that we care about at the regulatory level, right? Imagine that, you know, it would be like infeasible for some reason to do the sector by sector things. It'd be like too expensive, or we'd be very bad at, ensuring that the particular standards were met. But it'll be like less expensive, and we'll be really good at knowing whether the blanket approach has been, abided by across various sectors. So I think what we'd want to say in such a case is that it's likely that in some of those sectors, we would be doing something sort of suboptimal if you just like sort of took them in isolation and did kind of like the applied ethics of that use case. But we might nonetheless prefer at the regulatory level something more sweeping.
So yeah, we have 2 more questions, so we will try to take them. So Stratis first. I don't know if you want to do it yourself or I read it. So I will read it, and then is there any connection between transparency of black box models and attribution of responsibility, say a legal responsibility?
Good. John, you've been thinking about responsibility lately. Do you want to take a shot? I mean, I could riff on this, but if you have something in mind, go for it.
I don't have too much substantive, except that like there's very likely to be an intersection, and considerations of responsibility are likely to inform our duties of moral consideration and maybe our duties of epistemic consideration in ways that go beyond duties of transparency as well. So we think of our duties of agential consideration as just one species in the genus duties of moral consideration, and thinking about responsibility might broaden those out.
Yeah, that's roughly along the lines as I would have answered. Yeah, but I guess the short answer is yes.
Yeah, it should, right? Elizabeth, Elizabeth wants to ask about the epistemic value of explanation, but maybe you want to ask the question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank
please.
you very much. So thank you, Jeff and John and David and everyone for this presentation. It was really interesting. I've been thinking about a lot of the same issues in my PhD, which I am currently wrapping up.
All right.
So first of all, I just wanted to comment on the first question that you were asked about regulation and institutional structures. I thought that was a really interesting conversation. And just as a note, the World Economic Forum is putting out a series of case studies on different companies that are and looking at how these different companies are structuring themselves in order to implement AI ethics principles. I think their first one is out on Microsoft Research, and it was a really interesting read and might give you some really good food for thought.
Terrific, thank you.
Yes, no problem. But on a completely unrelated note, I have a question about the value of explanations. And you talked a lot about the moral aspect, about what we owe each other, and that we should be focusing on this as a source of information about how we should think about explanations we get from AI systems. But there's still this epistemic aspect where presumably we still do want to know or have some way of verifying that what an AI system is telling us is still true or epistemically well-founded in some way. And I'm wondering if in this case there isn't a double standard, but not because for some reason we don't necessarily want more from AI than humans, but because because we can't actually get more from human experts than we can from AI systems, because these are epistemically imbalanced relationships. Sort of by definition, a human expert or an AI system knows or has access to reasoning capacities that the novice user wouldn't have. So I'm just wondering, how do you navigate that conundrum of this epistemically imbalanced relationship, and that maybe this double standard is a problem, not because we shouldn't have a double standard, but because it's just impossible to get better explanations from either party?
Yeah, I think so. Let me take a shot at it and tell me if this is responsive. We are on board with the idea that sort of once take some context and imagine different ways of making decisions within that context. Some of them are going to be like automated to some extent, and some of them aren't. we are very friendly to the idea that once you start shifting the, like degrees of automatic, let's say the degree to which black box systems are used to make it in keeping with your question. The epistemic and sort of moral landscape might shift in that we might sort of morally start treating people better or worse. And that epistemically, yeah, it might make sense to start thinking that we're owed different kinds of information depending on what kind of system is in use. So if I heard the question correctly, then you could think of some of what John said about the juror thought experiment as exemplifying this. So yeah, maybe like in principle, we should always want information about how the inputs to the to the jury resulted in their verdict, and it's either infeasible or impossible to do it when there are like 12 people sitting there and they like go in their secret room and do their things, and like we might want it that way precisely because they're human decision makers. But those reasons to want it that way, there's like no a priori reason that we should expect those reasons to be present when we totally shift the sort of mode of decision making, even if it were functionally equivalent.
Okay.
And so I think if I'm hearing the question correctly, I just want to like express our enthusiasm for the idea that it might be totally reasonable to want the information sort of standards to shift.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks a lot for the question. Good luck finishing.
Thanks.
Thank you. So last time for the last question. Anyone?
There's a hand up in the.
Yeah, there's a hand up in the maybe.
Yeah, I have a Sai. Thank you, Ricardo, for inviting me. And I'm based in London, and I'm also in the European Union for about 10 years, trying to agree and disagree on exactly what we're discussing. And yeah. I have two questions and also thoughts for you three. I think your project is very valuable, incredibly valuable. So these are my questions and thoughts. When I have looked at black box models, the fundamental flow that we have seen, especially in the financial industry, is that they behave like cookie cutters. It is expected of the model that it's going to be infallible. But the problem we have is that because the actual black box doesn't have any jurisdiction in deciphering if the information that you feed it is actually true or false, it behaves like a cookie cutter. So you can put dough through it and you get cookies at the other end, but you can also put plasticine and you would get plasticine at the other end in very cute shapes. Yeah. So that's why we have seen that they are a disaster many times when you try to use them for stock picking and portfolio management and all that. In the EU, the problem that we have is that we're trying to manage 25 countries under a single market with 25 different cultures and understanding of what ethics and morality are. But fundamentally above that is each country is steered towards either a civitas civitatis, meaning the citizenship of the citizens, meaning let's trust in that people have common sense to behave like decent human beings. And then other nations that are fundamentally driven by the code of law, by the law, kind of biblical law, an eye for an eye. You steal a book, you go to prison. That's it. It's binary. So my question to you is, knowing that currently the world is evolving towards more kindness, more understanding of circumstances, of what drives an individual to break the law, how can we rehabilitate people, etc., yeah, abandoning the binary and trying to look for a black box that rather than giving you a binary result, is going to be more of an all-encompassing answer to something really complicated. do you think that fundamentally the structure of a black box is what's wrong? Because the ethics, everything else that we feed it with is in constant evolution and constant change and adapting itself to the circumstances that society goes through, which explains why in some countries, someone who has spent 10 years in prison and then you try to insert this person into society, you will be asking very different questions on his or her release. For example, do you have a place to live? Do you have family and friends that will support you? Yeah. So that obviously, if you say yes, yes, that means, well, this person is going to have like a little net where, and others are like, are you going to commit this crime again? Am I being understood? So thank you so much. I look forward to following your work because it's incredibly important. But I'm thinking the fundamental model of what a black box is needs to change. It cannot be assumed. It needs to be precise. I think it should be assumed it's going to give you an orientation. Do you share that opinion?
Thanks for the question. Oh, sorry, Ricardo, I just saw you unmuted. Did you want to?
No, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Okay. Yeah, I just
wanted to say thank you, Inma, for participating.
Thank you for the question, and thanks for your work on crucial problems. So I want to do my best to answer the last question directly, but I might have to warm up to it. So I think that some of what the question rested on toward the beginning is speaks to sort of like a much broader problem that transcends automated decision making, and it's a question about the proper theory of political governance given pluralism about values, right? And so the values that you asked about were sort of governance values themselves, like when we're going to use our coercive power that we've collected, that we exercise over each other. What do we want the rules to look like, and how should we go about structuring those things, given that some of us think it should be like heavily codified, you break the rule, you go to prison, as you said, and some of us think no, we need to sort of like exercise bits of individual judgment. So I emphasize sort of the nature of that question in part to cowardly to dodge it in a cowardly way. I think that however you think those questions of that kind ought to be handled writ large, presumably they'll sort of manifest themselves with application here. I'm not at all sure that John and David and I agree on sort of that level of political theorizing. And then maybe the second thing I'll say in an attempt to be responsive, Inma, is that I think some of the challenges you raised might speak to being very careful about limiting the scope of the use of automated decision making. So, concerns about I'm trying to sort of extend the cookie cutter analogy. I don't know. Like if you try to do too much with the cookie cutter, and then you get in these contexts where you're feeding it, things other than dough, you're going to have really big problems. But if in your baking, you rely on the cookie cutter only for like highly specialized tasks, that's one way of at least attempting to mitigate the difficulty of, as you say, the evolution of our collective thinking about these problems over time, and then being kind of restricted or boxed in by the use of the systems we've developed. I'm sure that I've not fully addressed the question, but I hope I partially addressed it.
Yeah, I guess depends in the cookie cutter can take also rocks and glass and other things to make very dangerous cookies. So we haven't talked about that. So we have Jennifer. You want to ask a question that you appeared, or?
No, I just want to add also the perspective from the machine learning side on this.
Sure,
That
please,
I agree
please
with
go ahead.
Jeff's last sentence saying that users should be aware what the cookie cutter is for. If it's just for cookie cutter, make sure you use only a cookie cutter, not something else, and be aware of that. And also the other thing too is that for developers like me who are on the machine learning side, at least we are now more aware about considerations that we have to look at in terms of ethics and morality and so on. But keep in mind that we can also incorporate this to the models themselves. So as things change, hopefully our conversations becomes smoother so that we understand each other's languages, so we can develop better methods to hopefully move forward in society. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. You got thumbs up from all of us there. Yeah. Thank you.
So let's take the last question and then we finish, because we are all over time, but clearly the people is really interested in the discussion. I think it's fascinating discussion. And the last question is from Sai Suprit that says that, are there any models that work on sentiment tuning using NLP techniques that can be used to set certain percentage to different kinds of cases? For example, level of criminality or moral level of sentiments, where the judgment is automated as shown earlier in the slides. So
maybe Jennifer, you can unmute and answer that question for us.
Yeah, box models that are thrown data at them and expect them to give a number that can be used to make a decision upon. So maybe it's a more general question and maybe a good question to answer another day.
Yeah, I think I'll just plead ignorance.
No, I think it's a good question, but it's for a machine learning person.
Yeah, it's for us. Yeah. And for an NLP person, but there are methods that can learn sentiments, except that it's not. I don't think we're at the level that it's highly accurate yet.
So Sai, in September, the distinguished speaker will be Emily Bender from University of Washington. I think that's a great question for her. So we will keep the question for September, and please come. And I invite all of you in 2 more weeks to attend the distinguished speaker seminar at this time, also 1 p.m. on Wednesday. And thanks, John, David, Jeff, great presentation and great discussion. So you set the standards for this seminar.
All right.
Thanks for hosting us.
Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation and to all of you for the conversation.
Thank you.
Here's all.
Thank you.